I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, as always, and for this, the last podcast of 2025, we have a juicy array of topics to get to. Amber is going to kick us off by talking about Nick Shirley's viral video seen around the world exposing the continued probe and further corruption and fraudulence in Minnesota, and in particularly concentrated in the Somali population there. I'm going to talk a little bit about year one of Trump 2's successful immigration policies. Inez is going to talk about what I would call no university for white men, or this James Hankins article around Harvard's hatred of white males and really the decline of Harvard University. And last but not least, Will is going to take us home to talk a little bit about AmFest and the state of the right. But with that, let's kick it off with Amber.
Thanks, Ben. Yes, this was indeed the video heard around the world by Nick Shirley, and it followed previous allegations of massive fraud in the Minnesota welfare programs, specifically for feeding hungry children. There was an organization called Feeding Our Future that was run by Somalis that has seen 70 plus indictments, the vast majority of whom are Somali Americans, who were using the state SNAP and WIC programs to take millions of dollars. They spent it on luxury goods, sent some back to Somalia, which ended up in the hands of terrorist groups. Nick Shirley did a follow-up piece of journalism where he focused on Somali-run daycares, which were receiving individually millions of dollars from the state. And some were not in current operation while receiving this money. Some are basically just empty buildings that don't have any children being dropped off for daycare services. He showed the owners of these supposed daycares refusing to answer questions, locking the doors when he showed up. Now, conveniently, after he reported on this, one of the most famous daycares, quote unquote daycares from the video, which was called Quality Learning Center. They forgot the N in learning on the sign, which doesn't bode well for their argument that they are indeed a functional learning center. Suddenly was busing in tons of kids to try to prove to the mainstream media cameras there that they were in fact functioning. But there was a state auditor of some kind who claimed that this place had actually just closed last week, but now suddenly it's open again and accepting children after the viral video. But it's very obvious what's going on here. And the response from Minnesota lawmakers, most notably, of course, the governor, Tim Walz, have been accusing people of white supremacy for calling out that this fraud does seem to be concentrated in the Somali community. He has claimed to have known nothing about this, although several state whistleblowers say that this has been reported to the government for at least a decade, and that they did nothing about it because they were receiving donations, political donations and votes from the Somali community. There's also similar fraud rings happening in other states, like Maine is a notable one where they've had whistleblowers come forward. And it's very pervasive. It's a lot of money. By Nick Shirley's estimate in his video, he found about $110 million of fraud just in those daycares that he investigated. But statewide, the estimates are as high as $9, $10, $11 billion that have been stolen from Minnesota taxpayers. One other thing that the Daily Caller was the first to report on was that the one of the top-ranking Republicans in the House of Representatives, Tom Emmer, who is a representative from Minnesota, was begged by his constituents back in 2016 in a town hall meeting that was covered on the podcast This American Life to stop the Somalians from coming in. They said they weren't assimilating, they were stealing money, and they wanted a moratorium on all Somali immigration into Minnesota. And Tom Emmer accused his constituents of racism and said that there was nothing that he could do, that Somalis were the fastest assimilating community in the United States, that they were just like the Germans. So basically, go pound sand. Now he's, of course, leading the charge and is one of the loudest voices calling for denaturalizing and deporting the Somalis. But it all just seems too little too late, right? They've already stolen all of this money. There's already been massive issues with rape in Minnesota and other areas where there's a concentration of the Somali population. The Trump administration has responded by promising to have the FBI investigate. The FBI has already led the DOJ to bring indictments against some of the individuals allegedly responsible for these fraud schemes. And it looks like, according to a statement from Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, that they are going to look at kicking these people out of the country as well. But with that primer, I'll kick it over to the group for thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that the failures of Doge within Washington, D.C., right, to root out corruption to the level that Elon Musk wanted to do and ran into all the predictable barriers within the way that government and the culture of Washington, D.C. works. It almost seems like that mission has been democratized now. And because it's not just in Minnesota, so people took what Nick Shirley did, and here I want to point out that the first two outlets to start covering this, or the first two reported pieces, one was Chris Rufo writing with someone, and the other one was Country Highway, who claims to have the story first. So there's like a credit war going on between those folks. But regardless, that has shown a national spotlight on this. And the more light is on this, the bigger and more obvious it seems. And there seems to be, like I said, this democratization of looking into this type of fraud, whether it's in medical service centers, daycare centers. So I've seen people using AI to try to track where these payments are going in Massachusetts, in other metro areas, trying to see what's going on, forwarding it to the federal government. So we may yet see the mission of Doge succeed. In terms of the specifics of this, what I'm most interested in is what happens to the politicians and the Democrats involved in this. It seems impossible that this level of fraud would take place without, at minimum, them looking the other way. And indeed, it seems like there's a lot of evidence that they actively stopped investigations from happening. And as Amber suggested, there are allegations that was essentially quid pro quo for block voting from the Somali community. If that's true, that itself is criminal. And those officials, those democratic officials, should go to jail, as well as the perpetrators of this fraud. So that's what I'm looking for. Is, in the Nick Shirley video, there's an interesting moment where there is a white Minnesotan lady who's just screaming, "Don't open the door! Don't open the door! It's ICE! It's ICE!" I mean, really, at the end of the day, like that's the problem. It's obvious that this community is importing all of the same cultural behaviors as they had back in Somalia. But the real problem is that we have elected officials, an entire party, and maybe half of the other party that was just willing to tolerate that for the sake of a kind of lie about, not wanting to be racially offensive or screaming racism at the fact of the matter and these cultural facts. So that's who I'd like to see held responsible ultimately.
On the politicians aspect of this, as we covered previously, there were ties between Ilhan Omar, there were ties between Keith Ellison, there were ties between Mayor Fry and those who were indicted and prosecuted in the Feeding Our Future case. And of course, there's been analysis out there, including my own analysis when it comes to Omar, on the campaign contributions received from the fraudsters. But the much deeper questions, and the ones that when these cases started to be investigated and prosecuted, which dates back to the Biden administration, that we don't know are how deep was the nexus between the politicians beyond what we can glean from publicly available materials? Is there evidence that's currently held by federal authorities that links the elected officials and their offices to the frauds? What do the politicians know? When did they know it? To what extent did they profit from it, directly or indirectly? And then this also brings us back to a much broader theme, and this is something that matters nationwide, but we're seeing a particular spotlight shown on it in Minnesota, which is the welfare state combined with open borders, and in particular, refugee resettlement, which, by the way, the refugee resettlement programs themselves have often been defrauded. And there's a financial incentive to increase refugee resettlement efforts among the NGOs that are involved with it, arguably. But basically, you had a Democrat Party there that imported en masse a population and then enabled that population to take advantage of a welfare state and then received political support from it in the way of votes. And then, of course, in the way of contributions as well. Then you also have, by the way, the complicity of the local media in the Twin Cities area in particular. Now, it's worth noting and crediting some others as well, because there have been some who have been on the case of Somali fraudsters and fraud in these programs dating back years. A few worth noting: Scott Johnson and the folks at Powerline more broadly, who've covered this extensively, folks at the Center for American Experiment, Alpha News as well, a local source. But the fact that Chris Rufo, Nick Shirley, and others have shined a light on this have exposed, I think, these much broader stories, which are national in terms of scope, which is, again, welfare state and then exploitation of the welfare state and who benefits from it. And so a doging of every single state's systems is absolutely necessary here. And I think that is really what matters at the end of the day. It's not about what happens or what's going to happen in Minnesota. The size, scope, and extent of the fraud is breathtaking when we're talking about potentially up to $9 billion, according to the U.S. attorney there. But it's these much broader themes about the welfare state itself, who exploits it, and then last but not least, who comes to the country matters. It's not just untrammeled immigration being a problem. It's not just illegal immigration, but legal immigration as well from folks that are from third world basket case countries that consist of people who have inimical views and oftentimes hostile views. And I think what we see here is the total contempt for America in the brazenness of having places like Luring Center instead of Learning Center. They're shoving it in our faces, and essentially you have the Democrats, and maybe some Republicans too, effectively paying tribute to this population here in Minnesota, and that's sickening.
Yeah, I mean, my father-in-law no longer does this, but for at least a decade, he ran a couple of childcare centers. And even now I can walk across the hall and see an enormous pile of paperwork that was involved in running those facilities. And I know the regulatory burden on childcare operators is immense. Like if you're actually trying to run a normal childcare that takes in kids and gives them care, it's just a very, very difficult, time-consuming undertaking. You're constantly worried about getting teachers in the door who are taking care of the kids well, making sure you're not below teacher staffing ratios, even when a number of teachers call in sick, which is a common thing because it's a competitive market. You have to keep your prices low. Wages for daycare workers are not super high. So it's a very, very challenging business to run. It consumed their lives for a decade. My father-in-law, my in-laws. And so to see the Somalis like not even really trying, I mean, you as someone who actually brings kids to daycare, that child Leering Center is obviously not a daycare. It's obviously non-functional because it's like a building in the middle of an ugly strip mall in the middle of the city. There's no outdoor play area. There's no it doesn't look like the kind of place you would ever send your child. And apparently nobody ever sent their children there. And this is common in a variety of places. It's just a vehicle for fraud. And I saw one thing that really bothered me. Like Batya had a whole take on the fact that, all this money that is being defrauded from us is one of the reasons that everything is so unaffordable. Like we're just paying the price of the fraud that's sucking value out of the economy and giving it to Al-Shabaab or something. And Connor Friedersdorf, some classical liberal weirdo, was like, how dare you, Batya? You're blaming the whole community for this. And part of me wants to say, most of the community is genuinely responsible for all this fraud. They're all in on it. They're all offering their kids up for kickbacks, huge numbers of them. And if, at a certain point, you sort of notice hey, it's the bulk of the community here. I'm sure there are individual Somalis who aren't participating and are very hardworking, blah, blah, blah. But it's a huge chunk of the community that is straight up just doesn't view our system as basically sees the United States federal government issuing these funds as something that they can just internalize and take for their clan and their tribe and doesn't see any moral compunction or any moral issue about taking the money away. So I'm really, this needs to be a major issue for a long time. I just don't think the Democrats can win in a world where everybody is thinking about how these Somalis are defrauding people.
Well, now I'll turn to a related story, which is the contrast of year one of Trump 2 with what came before it in the open borders under the Biden administration. And of course, there's a tie here to what's transpired in Minnesota and elsewhere. And I think if we're talking about sort of singular achievements of the first year of the second Trump presidency, it has to be immigration. And I just want to tick through some of the metrics here that show you the way in which the administration has secured the border, restored territorial integrity, and then got into work to historic levels on also resecuring the interior of the country. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about what happens in the years to come. But the first sort of headline number is that there are 2.5 million fewer illegal immigrants in the country today than when Trump returned to office on day one. So 622,000 deportations, which is nearly 3 times the highest amount of deportations recorded, which came back in 08 to 09. And those numbers were sort of padded, it seems like, for political reasons as well. But that's neither here nor there. 3 times as many, the more than 200,000 that were deported in 08 to 09. 1.9 million self-deportations, which is probably the real testament to the administration's efforts. It shows you the deterrent value of aggressive and vigorous border enforcement. Beyond that, border crossings are down 93%. For 2020, fiscal year 2026, so this is just including October and November numbers of this year, there have been the fewest encounters to the start of a fiscal year in modern history. It's amazing that this number has to be touted, but it obviously does relative to historic levels. But there have been 0 releases of illegal aliens apprehended for 7 straight months, according to an early December CBP release. There have been 73,329 total apprehensions along the southwest border, 53% less than the monthly average during the Biden administration. Of course, there's been temporary legal status, which has been stripped of hundreds of thousands of people who were oftentimes not vetted and probably should never have been let into the country. Beyond that, there's been a comprehensive effort to break down silos of data held by different federal agencies, which is a massive, massive in the weeds issue, because you have all these different information resources within the federal government, and they've been totally siloed, and you can't cross-reference these different databases to identify the population of illegal aliens and then go about pursuing them for deportation. So those have been, of course, challenged in the courts, as have many of the Trump administration's policies. But the 2.5 million headline number is already chipping away at a quarter of what transpired during Joe Biden, which in some ways shows you how daunting the task is when you're talking about how massive the invasion was, but nevertheless remarkable in terms of scope and scale. And then if you're looking at what's coming ahead in 2026, the AP recently reported that the administration plans to hire thousands of additional agents, open new detention centers. There's billions of dollars in incremental funding coming to border security and law enforcement efforts related to immigration. And there's going to be an effort as well, again, to dramatically increase workplace enforcement, which I've always argued is sort of the key to the whole ballgame. If you really want to ensure that the illegal alien population is dramatically reduced, you have to target the employers. And it may well be that a handful of significant raids or prosecutorial efforts could have an outsized effect ultimately. So with all that said, again, I think this is probably the primary policy core to the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as the administration dubbed it in its new national security strategy. This is what the president was elected on twice. And I think despite all of the challenges, despite in particular the legal resistance and, of course, the propaganda of regime media countering these efforts, I think this is a real singular achievement, securing the border, stopping the flow of illegal immigration, and then reversing the effects of the invasion. So I put it out to the group, what do you make of year one efforts and what are you looking for over the next 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very impressed with this as well. And I've seen some of the blackpilling on the right, and I think it's actually very unjustified. You don't reverse 30 years of essentially putting up a sign and say, on our border that says, come here if you like and do what you like. That was the unofficial policy of the United States for 3 decades. I think it's unrealistic to expect that all of those millions of people would be gone overnight, with the snap of a finger. I actually very impressed. The administration is obviously prioritizing this across different departments. Here, I'm thinking about the State Department scrutinizing visas, including student visas, much more than it used to. The Department of Ed is in this, right? And that's in addition, of course, to the Border Patrol and law enforcement. And there's clearly a multi-agency systemic effort across the federal government to use every avenue possible. I saw there was when the tensions are rising still with Venezuela. I saw Stephen Miller tweet about well, then maybe we can use this to get them deported. Or, it's obviously part of this broader focus and strategy. And I think it's working. And I think it would be a mistake to conclude that because the massive problem hasn't been solved yet overnight in 1 year, that they are, not working as hard as they can. And I've been impressed, too, with the intelligence of the efforts. I think the one piece that I agree with the critiques on of the Trump administration is on the employer side. That is obviously the most politically difficult piece of it for them to do, because they have businesses coming in saying, how am I going to operate my business? How am I going to, operate my farm? This is going to cause prices to rise in the grocery store. And of course, the president is very concerned about that as a potential political weapon, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not necessarily excusing them. I'm just saying that's the piece that I would keep an eye on and keep the pedal to the metal in terms of calling out the administration. There has not been significant employer side enforcement. And to my mind, that is the final piece of this puzzle that would make it the best it could possibly be on the immigration question within the confines of how the law is. That being said, I want to point out there are a lot of jobs open in this field. The administration has staffing problems. Part of the problem of coming in and trying to dismantle the DC beast is that basically all the people who were working in these agencies very, very much oppose your ends. And the Trump administration has, and I talked about it at length, the cases that they're launching essentially to be able to remove the officers that are in the federal government who are not doing the bidding of the president. That being said, when you get somebody out, you actually need somebody to do the work. So there are enormous opportunities. If you, for my next segment, if you're a white man being discriminated against at Harvard, you might want to consider whether your skills might be applicable in one of these agencies, because they are hiring and they need people to do this work. A lot of this, as Ben pointed to, is just requires bodies and intelligent and competent people to carry out the law.
Yeah, I totally agree on the employer side enforcement, especially since Trump, he's done some things to make it harder for H-1B applicants. He's increased the amount that employers have to pay to $100,000, but then publicly he's also said that he's very much in favor of expanding the H-1B program. So it's kind of mixed messaging there. But I wanted to highlight the self-deportation incentives that the administration has been giving. $1,000 plus a free flight home for most of the year. And then they upped that to $3,000 during December. And it's working, right? 1.9 million self-deportations through the end of the year, which is significantly more than the amount of people who were actually deported by the administration. And it's cheaper to do it that way, right? The $1,000 plus the flight is certainly cheaper than how much it costs to have ICE agents in the field tracking down illegal immigrants, having to go through the judicial process. So you're not only saving taxpayer money, but you're also getting people out of the country in a more efficient manner. And that's been a wildly successful part of the second Trump admin's immigration policy.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration has actually done a lot of things really well. I think we sort of take for granted that illegal crossings have basically stopped. There was a stat that just got put out on X. They looked at the month by month border encounters, and it went from 300,000 at the peak of the Biden wave in 2023 to less than 10,000, it looks like. Less than 10,000 encounters a month, so a few hundred a day. The Border Patrol is able to basically stop people from being admitted to the country. Illegal crossings have basically stopped. That's one of the most impressive policy accomplishments I can remember. It's a direct promise he made to the people to get the border under control, and he's delivered. A lot of people are complaining about deportations and the rate not being fast enough. I have two big points there. First off, the comparison to Obama is a frivolous one. Remember, Obama was trying to juke the stats and make it look like he was doing much more deporting than he actually was. So he was counting turnaways at the border as deportations. That's not like realistic. And as Trump can't do that because he's effectively stopped anybody from even trying. So he's not getting those cheap stats. And second, when people are here, they have these legal protections that exist under the statute, as we saw in the Abrego Garcia case, and we see in every one of these deportation cases, that allow judges to get involved. It's really, really challenging, really hard to get people deported. They're doing what they can, but it requires going through the process and building the machine of legal process in terms of prosecutors and immigration judges, et cetera, to churn through these people and get them removed if they've been in the country for a while. So the Trump administration is doing a lot. It's doing a great job. And I think we should, people shouldn't be so black-pilled.
With that, let's go to Inez on Harvard.
Yeah, I think another aspect where people should not be as black-pilled. I really have been impressed with this administration, and I want to bracket this by saying I criticized heavily the first Trump administration for not doing some of these things, both in immigration and especially because it's my field in the higher ed context. So it's not that I am afraid to criticize them. I genuinely think they are doing a stellar job, and one of the places in which they are doing a stellar job is higher education. That being said, obviously, our higher education institutions, our universities are nests of vipers. And we knew that already. But Compact, following up on the last pod we did where I highlighted this potential sort of permission structure piece from Compact Magazine about anti-white discrimination in a number of fields. They're following that up with a piece specifically from a Harvard professor who is resigning his position at Harvard primarily because of the discrimination against white males, but also in ideologically adjacent critique of the fact that they don't want to teach anything great about Western civilization. And in fact, he highlights Harvard turned down an enormous grant from a private foundation to do a Western civilization course because they simply did not want to focus on the greatness of Western civilization. Even when somebody was willing to donate millions and millions of dollars for them to do so, they weren't willing to do it. But those two things seem to have factored in to his decision to leave, to go to the University of Florida. They have the Hamilton Center there. And I wanted to highlight this not only because of the discrimination in admissions, and he points to specific instances where he had white male students who were incredibly promising and he said should have been at the top of any applicant pile, who had the best grades, who had the best test scores, who had the best, body of work when they were applying to graduate school, were turned down, and very explicitly because of their race and their sex. And he actually apparently was one of these students. He called around all the other graduate programs he had been turned down from, and all of them were doing the same thing. This was during, in some ways, the peak of the woke hysteria and the racial hysteria in 2020 and 2021. He also points to the way that the college has dealt with COVID as a reason for him leaving. But overall, I wanted to point to the story not only because of the obvious discrimination that we knew was happening in elite universities and how much worse it actually got and more explicit and more aggressive in 2020. It had been happening for decades, but it got very blatant in 2020 and 2021. Sorry, I lost my train of thought with my kid yelling at me. But not only was that discrimination going on for decades, it got much, much worse in 2020, much more explicit in both admissions and in hiring and in graduate programs, essentially cut off the pipeline for millennial and Gen Z white male talent. And we know that continued into the private sector. That's what the previous Compact permission structure article was about. So following up on last week, I do think that there's been a corner turned in the discourse on this subject. I think that is to the good, even if people can criticize, aspects of how this happens. It's always annoying when you're saying something at the top of your lungs for a decade, and then finally, the equivalent of the New York Times, although Compact is very good. I don't want to criticize Compact but the equivalent of, sort of the place where the libs will take it from. They publish the thing that you've known for 10 years and have been saying for 10 years, and then all of a sudden it breaks through into the discourse. So that's always annoying, but it is to the good that it happens, especially on this issue. In terms of the universities themselves, the final point I'll put on this is I see this as a very hopeful piece. Here we have a talented professor who is willing to be honest and to resign over this discrimination, who is going to what is essentially a new institution. It's been, stripped down to its core and now is being rebuilt, the University of Florida. And that's a project that needs to happen simultaneously with holding the old institutions like Harvard to the letter of the law. We have to build new institutions because the best we can hope for in Harvard is that they will go a little bit underground with some of this ideological discrimination. We're not going to change their minds. That would be that'd be a quixotic goal of ours. Our goal should be to curb them in line with the law that they need to follow, or destroy them if they refuse to come to heel under the law. But that being said, that's the best case scenario there, is that you kind of dial back slightly on the ideological degradation that's present in some of these institutions. So that means we need new institutions, and Hillsdale, but there's new ones out there as well. The University of Florida is one of them, and it's encouraging to see talent migrating there as the result of this kind of ideological breaking point. I didn't ask a question, everybody. Sorry.
I was ready to go. You got to wonder at what point are these sort of white male wannabe academics going to realize that they just can't even go into the field. I mean, I remember thinking in law school, maybe at trying to aim for the law professor track would be more up my alley, because I had a sense that sort of practicing big law wouldn't be for me, just in terms of the hours and the grind, and I was never better at working harder than other people. Like I could be more clever than other people, but I was not, I'm ADD. I wasn't going to win a competition where it was going to depend on my ability to be really industrious. And so I was like, oh, maybe I'll go to the law professor track. But the idea of getting into the law professor track as a white male conservative is just absurd. It's absurd. Every law school is dominated by left liberals, and who, if they aren't going to exclude you on the basis of your politics, are certainly going to exclude you on the basis of your race and sex. So it's just silly. And I mean, that's the phenomenon at every academic department now, is this thing made clear. And it's not just academic departments, it's private film studios, it's anything where liberals are dominant. If you're a white male, even if there are white males currently in power, they're just going to use the fact that they're there to not include you because there needs to be diversity. And obviously they can't give up their jobs. So, it has to be a generational war against millennials. I think this is, if you've seen obviously the young males are moving so far to the right, it's ridiculous. They're part of the Republican Party now, basically. I don't see a reason why they'd start voting for Democrats and voting for their own professional suicide. So, and this is just yet another example of it, I think. But I think you guys have talked about this before, that this is a permission piece. It's allowing, even more moderate people to talk about the fact that there's just this widespread discrimination against white people, which Jeremy Carl, friend of the podcast, has been on about and wrote an entire book about. But yeah, I don't know if you're a straight white male, why on earth would you be a liberal? They're trying to, you're on the menu for their party, and I don't know why you'd submit to being eaten.
I'll throw in a little black pill into the chat because, as great as it is to see these pieces come out and people being more willing to talk about anti-white racism and discrimination, the Democrats are still trying to do this, even the so-called moderate Democrats. Abigail Spanberger, who was just elected to be the new governor of Virginia, where I live, has announced her choice for Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the state. And it's a total nut job. This woman's name is Dr. Sesha Joy Moon. She says that DEI is nonpartisan and has a constitutional mandate, but then in other comments has suggested dismantling the Constitution. She's a big fan of Jasmine Crockett and Stacey Abrams. So as much as the culture has shifted and the conversation has shifted, and Democrats say that they're doing this whole soul searching project post 2024, they're still very much trying to appease their progressive activist base. And so we definitely cannot get complacent and think that we've shored up a victory because the Trump EEOC is tackling anti-white discrimination. It is still going to be pushed very heavily, even by the most supposedly moderate Democrats. And if they take back power federally in any way, we can expect that they are going to try to re-implement a lot of these regimes.
So on the story itself, which obviously naturally follows from that Jacob Savage piece, which was talking about some other sectors of the economy and the anti-white and anti-male discrimination and anti-white male discrimination there. It's extremely telling that we're talking about these pieces in late 2025, years after the worst excesses of this discrimination and bigotry were readily apparent to everyone who was witnessing them. And obviously, that shows you the power and the fear that was instilled in individuals across these institutions based upon that sort of anti-cultural revolution that took place, really starting with and emanating from George Floyd and Minnesota. So we go back to Minnesota, I guess, here. But beyond that point that we're talking about, kind of years after this was all readily available for everyone to see. Just to follow up on Amber's point, you have entrenched interest groups here that are so reliant on this ideology and dependent upon it for their livelihood that even setting aside the fact that there have been generations of people brainwashed into a worldview which says that discrimination is good, righteous, and just. You have programs. Just take, for example, race-based contracting with governments. If you look at the U.S. federal government, I'm going to be writing a little bit about this for Real Clear Investigations in the near future. There are programs that are explicitly based on gearing contracts towards quote unquote socially and economically disadvantaged people. And in practice, these programs prior to the Trump administration anyway, were essentially affirmative action handouts where you had basically preferential contracts, often no bid or limited bid contracts given out to companies that claim that they were minority owned. And there's a whole level of fraud, by the way, that the Trump administration is investigating here as well. But we're talking about tens of billions of dollars annually in federal contracts given out effectively on the basis of race. Then when you go down to the state and local levels, that number multiplies because you have race-based contracting for state and local governments as well. This is just government contracting with firms. This is setting aside, of course, the private sector implementation of a DEI regime itself. And so when you think about all of the people who are invested in this, to the point where there are even consultancies that are used by these firms to claim discriminated against status, et cetera, on top of the academics, et cetera, you're talking about just massive, massive entrenched bureaucracies here that all profit directly or indirectly from propagating and perpetuating this worldview. So the Trump administration is doing yeoman's work here, following on the executive orders that the administration put forth very early on. But you're going to need codification in law. You're going to need vigorous enforcement of the law, and not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well. We haven't really seen, I can't point to, maybe some of you can, Congress actually codifying the anti-DEI efforts in law. Then, of course, you're going to have all of these institutions that, to Inez's point, engage in sub rosa efforts to de facto do what they did before in terms of discrimination. So ultimately, absent a cultural reckoning, which has yet to happen, it's very hard to imagine this regime completely falling. So this isn't to put forth a black pill take, but it is to say this is a massive, massive generational fight. The president can do a lot, can set the tone, can have an outsized impact in terms of policies, but ultimately it needs to be a comprehensive all of society effort to purge modern discrimination from the public square. And on that note, we can turn it over to Will to talk about a completely different topic, AmFest and the state of the right.
So yeah, AmFest was almost 2 weeks ago at this point, or I guess a week and a half ago back in Phoenix. And it was a pretty dramatic event in the sense that what it ended up being was a bunch of influencers kind of going at it with each other. That was the big headline of the event. I mean, I think Ben Shapiro spoke first and threw down the gauntlet at Tucker, Megyn Kelly, any number of other people, basically talking about how basically on the subject of Candace Owens in particular, And I think everybody there probably would have agreed, well, maybe save Tucker, but that Candace's conduct is absolutely ridiculous. Meghan herself has, previously done a hit where she was like some of the questioning, not calling out Candace by name, but certainly not a fan of Candace going after Turning Point. It's reflective of sort of a broader dynamic on the right where as the good as things are, I think people are fighting a lot. And one of the things I tweeted in the day of, I think that there's a lot more agreement among the actual Republican voters than there is. The fighting among the influencers is not reflective of actual fighting among the Republican voters who are broadly happy with Trump. The influencers are dealing with trying to make sure that there are people watching on their podcasts. So there's going to be a big chunk of them drawn to conspiracy nonsense, and then a big chunk of them really infuriated by that. And rightly so, actually. I think a lot of people, everybody has a right to be extremely angry with Candace, what she's doing is just awful. But it's end up leading to a lot of bickering back and forth between influencers that I don't think is actually that productive. That said, I'm worried about it because if over the next year everybody's so divided and is still obsessing over Israel, which as far as I can tell is as an issue should be really far down on the list of people's concerns right now. The war is over. If anything, Israel has just announced that it's doing a huge investment in its own military production capacity, which is going to obviate the need for American aid in probably 10 years. So I don't know what people are so upset about and obsessing about, and yet it seems to be dominating our conversation, probably because there's a certain subset of influencers, Dave Smith et al., who are in the position of having argued that the invasion of Iran, or rather not the invasion, but the military action against Iran would lead to World War III, and then it didn't. If anything, it looks like that one specific action by Trump resolved the war in Israel's favor, and then also Iran now is in such terrible shape that it might have its own kind of independent revolution. So there's no real problem with Israel yet. It seems like the discourse focuses on that. Plus, you have Candace focused on Charlie Kirk. I think hopefully I hope, and I guess the white pill way to look at it is that the reason that so much online discourse is focused on this stuff is because normal people aren't worried about politics right now. It's an off year. So the people who are particularly politics obsessed are the most likely to be conspiracy obsessed. And I think things will get better in the run up to the midterms. I'm still worried, though. Obviously, it would not be good for Republicans to lose in the midterms, and that's the most likely outcome. I hope that we can get people kind of focused on unifying. Yorm had a very interesting post today where he talked about the world in which what he called high-strung liberal Zionists fighting with anti-Semites all day, every day, is one that splits and polarizes the right entirely. And he's very, very critical of the use of the phrase woke right, as I have been for a long time, because what it is, it's the centrist liberal James Lindsay types trying to call everybody to the right of them beyond the pale and yank the coalition in their direction and make anathema huge chunks of the coalition who voted for Trump. I don't think that's very healthy. I think you can simultaneously say the centrist liberals like James Lindsay are not part of the team. They're in a divisive project, while also saying Tucker Carlson's project of creating a friend-enemy distinction around your support or antagonism toward Israel is also extremely divisive and bad for the Trump coalition. There needs to be sort of a reasonable centrism that lands in the middle of the Trump coalition that keeps the thing going. So the influencer wars aren't good. AmFest was obviously, I guess, maybe necessary to, yell at Tucker because he certainly deserves it. But I'm hoping that we can kind of move past that and get to something more reasonable going forward.
Yeah, the most absurd part of, look, first of all, what was on display, I didn't even watch most of this because, frankly, I find it embarrassing. The weird sort of vibe of D-list celebrity that has always been a part of discourse on the political right, think back to CPAC, that was just on full display and embarrassment and has been. And I don't know, I find it completely counterproductive. And at this point, given the dangers that the left poses to this country, people who would exploit this for personal gain or for, D-list celebrity, I just find very contemptible. But I think in terms of the more serious ideological divides, the problem is that Trump gave the people who are, let's say, more legitimately skeptical of the U.S. role in the world, skeptical of all alliances that the U.S. has had, including the U.S.-Israel alliance, very, very worried about finding ourselves entangled in foreign affairs in a way that, worsens or at least distracts from domestic affairs that are so serious. All of those are legitimate concerns. the president essentially gave those people the result, as Will hinted, that they wanted, right? There is no more war now in Gaza. We were able to take out the piece of Iranian power that most threatened us, the United States, without a single life lost and certainly without getting embroiled into a long regime change war. If they were honest brokers about these questions, they would find those two things facts to be celebrated. The fact that they have not reacted that way, I think, there are really only two motivations for not reacting with joy when the good outcomes that you claim to be in favor of happen. The first is obvious, which is anti-Semitism, and that's driving some of the focus. But I think the other one is influence, right? You predict a bunch of stuff. It doesn't come true. You either go down the rabbit hole like Candace and just keep predicting wilder and wilder things and larger cover-ups, or you have to have some humility about the fact that your ideology actually didn't predict the way that the world works. And so I don't know, where on the spectrum of those motivations most of these people are, but overall, I find it, yes, worrying in part because of the very serious challenges that we have to come. And I don't just mean the midterms. I mean, the things that we were talking about for the previous segments about dismantling a leftist network of institutional power that is at best been caught on its heels, but is by no means gone and will return immediately if we lose the next election or we lose certain levers of power. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I didn't watch AmFest, so I'm not gonna. I'll just point out that on the smallest and but most, in some ways, emotional aspect of this, right? This should not have been the outcome of AmFest after Charlie's death, right? And it is on the people who are people like Tucker and so on, who, by the way, had this very weird aspect of his speech. This part I did watch, saying that actually, there's no problem with Islamism. Actually, it's all a ruse by the Zionists to actually we can get along just fine with Islamism in the United States, which just seemed absurd. But I mean, all of this, it just makes me sad. Obviously, Charlie was a incredibly important figure on the right, and we, as I predicted, sadly, and I don't want to be right about this, I don't think he is replaceable. What has happened is a lot of students have stood up, and we're proud of them and we're happy for them. But the leadership of the right, they took out a good one. The left took out a good one. When they took out Charlie, took out somebody very, very important to the infrastructure and the ideological direction of the right, and everything that's happened since his death has found the right more divided and less able to counter the left than when he was alive.
Yeah, one of the things that Erica Kirk addressed in her opening speech at AmFest was the fact that no one really understood how much of a coalition builder Charlie was until after he was assassinated. And the fractures and fissures that we've been seeing since then are indicative of how good he really was behind the scenes at keeping people together, of navigating these rifts in ideology and personality, and trying to keep the focus on fighting the left. I'll just briefly address some of the Candace stuff, because I get this sense that people are afraid to call her out because she does have such a loyal and devoted audience who works together to attack anyone who questions her. But her claims and her supposed questions she's been asking have gotten increasingly insane. The latest was that now Cabot Phillips was apparently at the military fort with Erica Kirk and the head of TPUSA security the day before Charlie was assassinated, when he has photos and surveillance footage of him attending an ultrasound with his wife and buying materials for a gender reveal. The guy, the supposed military source who has been the impetus for this newfound focus on this alleged military meeting, is such a psycho that even Alex Jones has come out and released several investigatory podcasts exposing this guy for the nut job that he is, and asking people to pray for Candace because he even thinks that she's lost her mind. So it's so annoying and frustrating that because she has this cult-like audience, that if you don't respond, she turns that into a reason to assume guilt and throws more people's names into her podcast. But then when you do respond, of course, you are sort of feeding the fire and distracting yourself from what should be the mission. And so there's almost no winning way to approach the insanity with which she's been conducting herself since Charlie was assassinated. And I think that's one of the biggest issues with this infighting and the conspiracy theories, is that there's not a perfect answer for how do we tamp this down and try to get back to where we were a few months ago.
So I have a kind of a comprehensive treatment of a lot of this infighting and separating good faith from bad faith and legitimate from illegitimate coming in an essay that's going to be part of a book anthology on the criticality of harmony and positive relations between Jews and Christians if we want to ultimately triumph as a civilization. So I will point people there ultimately for my comprehensive thoughts on all of this. But what I will say is it certainly appears that among some of the influencers, setting aside, what is actually them being intellectually honest in their own view, or what is about profit and driving clicks and trying to ensure that you have a massive monetizable base of listeners and viewers, that the effect of all this is to essentially execute Operation Disunite the Right. I mean, cleaving Jews from Christians and then pitting Christians against Christians as well, and using nominally Israel, but oftentimes, obviously, Judaism as the wedge. What could be more damaging to a movement where evangelical Christians make up a disproportionate percentage of the MAGA base and of the right? So on a political level, it's malpractice, and it seems like an effort to sabotage and subvert the movement. And then, of course, we can have massive and vigorous debates on the substance. I will note it is telling, you have folks who are sort of self-styled, just asking questions, skeptical, or even openly anti-Zionist, they claim, but they love Jews, but they hate Israel, essentially. They hate the Jewish state. But by contrast, there's a real tell when you see the love of U.S.-Arab relations. And that tells you that it isn't just about not wanting to have relations with anyone else in the world, not thinking U.S. national interest is being advanced based upon the policies that are being pursued. It tells you that it is about one state and it is about one relationship. And we hear a lot about, well, you're not allowed to have a debate. There hasn't been an open debate among a lot of these actors on what does U.S. national interest demand in the Middle East? How do we best go about achieving it? What have been the costs and benefits of all of the relationships as currently constructed? You never hear the talk about what about U.S.-Egypt relations? What about U.S.-Turkey relations? We can run through the laundry list of countries here. And that tells you, I think, what's really going on here. So at the end of the day, again, I think Will is right that the influencers do not represent the voting public writ large. However, they do also have disproportionate sway. And it is clear that there's been, and obviously social media doesn't represent real life either, but there has been obviously much more open Jew hatred than at any time that I've ever witnessed in my life. And that's disconcerting on the right because the left is already done. I mean, the left has already institutionalized this view, whether or not they say it's anti-Israel or actually antipathy towards the Jews. That is the party line at this point. If the right goes there as well, and I'm not saying it's there, I'm not saying it's even close to a majority of it, but this is a canary in the coal mine because ultimately the forces who hate all of us, they want to dominate the Jews, they want to dominate the Christians, and they want to subvert our civilization. So this is a canary in the coal mine thing here. And it is something that we have to watch because ultimately it is Judeo-Christian Western civilization. And it starts with the Saturday people, but it goes to the Sunday people and everyone else. And a rejection of the Jews is ultimately symbolic of, and also, again, a canary in the coal mine for what comes for everyone else down the road. So if you want to disunite the right, and then you ultimately want to unwind the republic, this is the way that you go. And I hope that this is just an internecine battle between influencers, but I tend to think it's not. I tend to think it goes beyond that. And ultimately, political movements have to be discerning about the views they tolerate and the people who they hold up as the leading luminaries. And so that is something that I do think, we're going to be talking about and debating about and thinking seriously about in the months and years ahead. So on that note, we can kick it over to parting shots with whoever wants to go first.
Well, I have two parting shots and one related to what Ben just said, so maybe I'll just go first. I'd recommend and yes, I'm not being paid by Matt Schmitz. I have two more compact pieces that I want to highlight in in final thoughts. But the first is on this question on the JQ by David Azarad, just tour de force in terms of actually taking the JQ seriously and answering some of the the things that people notice that they feel can't be talked about. So just giving the Steelman treatment to Zog and the JQ, and then demolishing it. And I really recommend reading that essay in full. The second is not as perhaps like sort of exciting or fun in terms of a narrative to read, but very interesting. There's been a massive expansion in Brussels and in the EU, basically of grants going to essentially the network of left-wing NGOs that are finding themselves defunded by some of the efforts of the Trump administration. Well, the EU is stepping up to fund some of those organizations and keep some of those people on the payroll. It's just kind of interesting. The funding of that piece of what I think Ben rightly called the NGO complex or something to that regard is moving across the Atlantic, and definitely something to keep an eye on.
My final thoughts are on an extension of the Minnesota fraud we were talking about. On December 22nd, a Washington state senator introduced a piece of legislation that would extend privacy protections for home daycare operators to all daycare operators. This was about a week before the Nick Shirley video dropped. And since then, the head of the state GOP has raised alarms about Somali-run daycares in Washington. And the state AG, who is a Democrat, has been whining that the Somali daycare operators in their state are being, quote unquote, harassed for information about their supposed services that they're offering. And so I'm very curious about what this Washington state senator knew on December 22nd that caused her to introduce that bill. And I would not be surprised if we start seeing massive fraud investigations in other states as well.
Yeah, my final thoughts are on something we didn't talk about, but there's a lot of debate on X over the potential for a wealth tax in Silicon Valley. California lawmakers, including Ro Khanna, have been putting out noises about both either a California wealth tax on its own or a federal wealth tax where they confiscate a certain percentage of the country's wealth. It kind of connects really with this interesting Somali fraud scandal because it's revealing that the Democratic Party platform is we need to confiscate the wealth of successful business startups in order to ensure that Somali fraudsters are continuing to be able to loot the fisc. I don't think that'll be the most popular platform of the American public. But I'm also not particularly sympathetic to a lot of these Silicon Valley people who have been running high dollar fundraisers for Democrats for years. And all of a sudden they're on the menu for these Democratic politicians. Like maybe you should have figured out who your friends were. Republicans were a little tired of being censored and stuff on big tech, but we're not the kind of people who are going to confiscate your wealth. Unless, of course, you're a university, then we're going to seize your endowment. But beyond that, I think we're fine. And I want these Silicon Valley people to sort of get with the program and realize that the Republicans are your friends if you want them to be, but we're not going to have any more, if you're going to keep doing fundraisers for Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg, then, if the Democrats come around and seize your wealth, well, I hope it goes well for you guys. Hope you do fine.
There's obviously a lot going on in the world right now. I would prefer in the parting shots to just turn inward to all of you and to our listeners and viewers and just wish everyone all the happiness, health, and wealth possible in 2026. Hopefully, it's a peaceful and prosperous year for all of us, for our families, and obviously for our nation as well. And on that note, on behalf of Will, Inez, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad in 2026.